All right. Well, why don't we talk about our decode segments? Today, I wanted to focus a little bit on the economy because Trump has taken Americans on quite a ride on the topic of stimulus. So let's discuss where Americans are financially. Tens of millions of Americans are still jobless during this pandemic. And what's worse is the fact that many of these jobs are expected to be permanent job losses. The longer the pandemic continues, the longer these layoffs persist, it's much more likely that these will be permanent job losses. And so what's interesting is after the CARES Act and the regulations that came along with the CARES Act expired on September 30th, all of a sudden you have all of these various corporations and companies that took some of the financial relief from the CARES Act, laying off tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of their employees. The airline industry was certainly hit the hardest. And in the next video, you'll get a sense of just how much.
Thousands of airline industry workers are out of a job, hoping Congress will send a financial lifeline their way. Many of them are being furloughed or laid off today after talks on Capitol Hill to extend government relief programs amid the pandemic stalled. Across the board, an estimated 45,000 employees are being affected by these job cuts.
So the unemployment rate is still insanely high at 7.9%. And in the latest jobs report from the Labor Department, it was clear that the, recovery from the pandemic is slowing down considerably. But some people are delusional enough to completely deny the reality of this moment, like the guy you're about to hear from.
Layoffs at Disney, Shell, the airline furloughs, Goldman Sachs with 500 employees being laid off. You're not too worried about unemployment?
Not yet. Thanks for having me on. So, we've had some bad headlines, but, keep in mind those numbers sound terrible, but they're not enormous in the context of the size of the total U.S. labor market.
Oh, okay, great. So why don't we take a look at the full context of the U.S. labor market? Because it turns out that the situation is pretty crappy, and it's more than just a few negative headlines. So don't listen to what cool guy economist Michael Darda has to say. Focus on the numbers, and I'm not talking about how the stock market is doing, because the stock market is completely detached from what the real economy is communicating about the American people and where they stand today in regard to their finances. So when it comes to the more recent layoffs, that list includes Disney eliminating 28,000 employees connected to the coronavirus theme park shutdowns, United Airlines and American Airlines collectively planning to put 32,000 workers on furlough, and ensure Allstate cutting almost 4,000 jobs. Many small businesses have shut down. They're not expected to make a return. The Labor Department, as I mentioned earlier, had released new jobs numbers and found that there are more Americans filing for unemployment than was previously expected. So, for instance, first-time claims for unemployment benefits totaled 840,000 last week, higher than expected in another sign that the spike in job growth over the last summer has cooled heading into Election Day. Economists surveyed by Dow Jones had been expecting 825,000 new claims. Honestly, as if that's any better. And following that labor report, it became very clear to anyone who's paying any attention to the real economy as opposed to the stock market that the job recovery has slowed down. And when it comes to the job losses that are permanent, the situation is getting very serious. So for instance, nearly 3.8 million people lost their jobs permanently in September. And that's, again, according to the Labor Department's latest monthly survey, almost twice as many as the height of the pandemic job losses in April. So, cool guy economist, are we giving you enough context to convince you that the situation's pretty dire for the majority of Americans right now? I can give you more. The poor do keep getting poorer, especially because many of them haven't even recovered from the last recession. So let's take a look at that graphic. Even in brutal recessions of the early 1980s, when the unemployment rate topped 10%, less than a quarter of job seekers had remained out of work longer than 6 months. What we're actually experiencing now is that job losses end up lasting much longer than previous recessions. And that puts people at a downward trajectory when it comes to their earning power because of the way this entire economy is set up. So for instance, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, nearly half of all job seekers had been unemployed long term. Many younger people dropped out of the job market altogether, while long-term unemployment for workers older than 50 stayed at high levels for years. In fact, millennials certainly hadn't fully recovered from the 2008 recession, and then the pandemic hit. And as you can imagine, that creates a much more difficult situation for them to dig themselves out of this hole. And keep in mind, many of them are dealing with an insane amount of student loan debt to boot. So millennials have an incredibly small amount of wealth compared to other generations in this country. So there was some new data from the Federal Reserve that should, I want to say shock everyone, but honestly, if you've been paying attention to how this system is set up, it shouldn't be shocking. The millennial generation, born between 1981 and 1996, controlled just 4.6% of U.S. wealth, even though they are the largest in the workforce with 72 million members. So many of them are underpaid, many of them are underemployed, trying to basically piece together several jobs in order to earn a full-time income. But even that full-time income doesn't make enough money to basically keep up with the cost of living in many of the major cities across the country. So overall, a small percentage of companies cut salaries when it comes to senior executives. But even among businesses that did cut the boss's pay, 2/3 of the chief executives took reductions that were equivalent to only 10% or less of their 2019 compensation. So while the average American worker has been hit hard by this pandemic, that doesn't stop executives and CEOs from shielding themselves from some of the pain that many of us are feeling right now. For instance, Oscar Munoz, who in May became United's executive chairman after serving as chief executive, did not get a salary from March 10th through June 30th, which amounted to a $610,000 pay cut from the $2 million salary he's being paid. But the reduction was little less than 3% of the $22.2 million Mr. Munoz took home in 2019. Remember, the salary for these executives is nothing. They make the real money when it comes to stock options, when it comes to other investments. That's where the real cash is. And if you take a look at the stock market, it's abundantly clear that it is, in fact, detached from what people are experiencing in the real economy. The stock market's doing really well. And as long as these executives hold on to their stock options, and as long as they're able to keep taking money from the Federal Reserve and artificially inflate the price of their shares, they're able to make a ton of money even during this pandemic, even while they're laying off tens of thousands of their own employees. And, let's also talk about bonuses a little bit, because these people wouldn't be stupid enough. They wouldn't be callous enough to pay themselves bonuses during this year, right? I don't know. Let's take a look.
A new survey shows that despite some of this gloomy news, 66% of companies still intend to pay bonuses this year.
I mean, were you guys really surprised? Were you surprised? Of course they're going to pay themselves bonuses. They don't care. I mean, part of the problem in this country has been the insane amount of income and wealth inequality. That didn't just happen overnight. It happened with all of these executives and all these major companies essentially underpaying their workers while cutting corners, paying themselves more and more money each year, paying themselves more and more stock options each year, while trying to justify the so-called cost cutting that specifically impacts their own workers, the very people who made them wealthy in the first place. And while all this pain and suffering takes place, all the pain and suffering takes place, the richest people in the world keep paying themselves and shielding themselves from this pandemic. All we need is a president to troll us about the possibility of financial relief. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did this week.
even though it was a long shot, there was still some hope that potentially a deal could come together. But the president, after having a conference call with Republican leaders and Steven Mnuchin, put out this tweet that surprised everybody on Capitol Hill. It makes it clear that there will not be a stimulus deal before the November elections. And this is the important part of this multi-part tweet that the president put out. He says that I have instructed my representatives to stop negotiating until after the election, when immediately after I win, we will pass a major stimulus bill that focuses on hardworking Americans and small businesses.
That's right. Hopped up on steroids and an ever-expanding ego, Donald Trump decided to troll the American people in regard to the possibility of another stimulus bill. Now, why do I say troll the American people? Well, because soon after, he changed his mind. But I don't want anyone to think he changed his mind because he realized that he'd be hurting average Americans. He doesn't really care too much about them. What he does care about, though, is the stock market, because it is the one and only thing that he has been able to cite as a symbol of his success, as a symbol of his economic intelligence, even though, again, the stock market is not representative of how average Americans are doing. When you look at the individuals who are invested in the stock market, over 80% of them are in the top 10%. So if the stock market's doing well, it's not necessarily positively impacting the finances of average Americans. Actually, quite far from it. But he realized, oh no, this tweet, it did bad things. Very bad, not good, to the stock market. After the president's initial announcement, stocks fell sharply, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average ending down 376 points. And Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell warned that there could be unnecessary hardship if Congress and the White House don't approve more economic relief. And so on the same day, later that day, Donald Trump changed his tune, writing, the House and Senate should immediately approve $25 billion for airline payroll support and $135 billion for Paycheck Protection Program for small business. Both of these will be fully paid for with unused funds from the CARES Act. Have this money, I will sign now. And then he followed it with, COVID relief negotiations are moving along. Go big, go big. And now all of a sudden, Donald Trump is saying, you know what, that $2.2 trillion that the Democrats want for their stimulus plan, maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to go bigger. So yesterday, he put out his own version of stimulus. Don't get too excited because I don't trust him or believe him at all. But Trump, according to the latest announcement, Trump favors a broad economic aid package. He suggested during a radio interview earlier on Friday he could support a stimulus plan bigger than the $2.2 trillion amount Democrats are seeking. Now, the Trump administration did put forth their own proposal, $1.8 trillion stimulus offer to Democrats, but they spurned it and said it didn't do enough to tackle the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. It contains $1,200 direct payments to Americans, of course, $4,000 weekly federal employment benefits, and significant aid to states. Now, let me be clear. If he actually does push legislation like this, or better than this, awesome. The problem is he's erratic. He is obviously not in the right state of mind. He's all over the place. He's saying all sorts of crazy, lunatic things. So I have a hard time feeling relieved at the current messaging from Donald Trump because he shoots from the hip and you don't know what he's going to propose next. What I do know is that in all of this chaos, in all of this drama, while so many Americans are feeling so much heartache, so much struggle, there has only been one voice of reason, one person who actually speaks to those issues. We had an opportunity to get him elected as president of the United States. But unfortunately, we can only rely on his tweets to make us feel as though we're being heard. And of course, that's Bernie Sanders. He tweeted the following. In the last few days, Trump has been for a stimulus package, against it, and for it. What will the stable genius say next? All I know is every unemployed worker needs $600 a week. Working class families need $2,000 a month, and every American needs the same health care as Trump. That's absolutely right. The only problem is we don't have a presidential candidate who believes in that message, and that's the real problem. But for now, we're just going to sit by and see what Trump is going to say next. And anytime he has any type of positive message in regard to financial stimulus for average Americans, it's usually followed by Mitch McConnell, the turtle man himself, whining and crying about how it's just too expensive, too much spending, unless, of course, it comes to bailing out corporations. In that case, he's in favor of it.
Yeah. This segment reminded me of the fact-checking talk we had, was it last week or the week before, where, because I remember when Trump was running in 2016, one of the things he kept on saying was that the unemployment figure, folks, it's fake, and like the fact-checkers like were freaked out. But there's some degree of truth to that idea that the way the unemployment number is calculated is problematic, to say the least. It's like it's only the people who are actively looking for a job who can't find one, but that doesn't count for people who like quit looking for a job just because they're hopeless or for whatever other reason, So like that unemployment, those unemployment numbers, like even that this like 7% number, which like as you said is like really high right now, it probably doesn't even tell the whole picture in any way.
It's an underestimate for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Like you're absolutely right about that.
And this like this talk about like all the CEOs like paying themselves and all that stuff. I just can't stop thinking that it's so different from what it was 20 years ago or in the 90s, when the sort of ideological underpinnings of that kind of thing were so much more self-confident, right? Like there were true believers that the system was good and righteous, even as like CEO pay soared, like people were out there defending like this is actually good because it spurs innovation and it motivates people to take risks and all that stuff. And like now no one makes those arguments anymore. Like they're just like, it's just like, no, give me the money and I'm gonna shut up and you're gonna shut up and no one's gonna do anything about it. So there is kind of an ideological void. So you get that feeling that we're like at the end of an era. I mean, that's like what's so frustrating and exciting at the same time about this moment is like the economic collapse is so much more broad and widespread than we can even wrap our minds around, and that we can even quite comprehend in like as we're kind of sitting through it in the early days of it. It's going to take years to really understand what the effects that it's going to have. But the reality is that the ideological kind of superstructure above it is just gone. Like no one is making the case that this is actually good anymore. So that's the opportunity in a way. Yeah.
I remember, in a very specific context, when it comes to presidents at universities, I would complain about how much they pay themselves as they're increasing tuition for their students. And I get it. If they take a pay cut, it's not going to solve the tuition problem, but it's mostly symbolic. I mean, it's incredibly insulting to pay yourself $1 million a year while students are going into an insane amount of debt because of tuition costs. And I remember someone debating me on that issue said, well, they need competitive pay. No, they don't. Why? Are they like so talented that they need, like the only thing that they're talented in is fundraising, asking for money. And so that's all it's about. And I personally don't think that's like an incredibly unique, important skill set that warrants paying a college university president $1 million salary. Like it makes no sense. But you're right. I think that this has hit so many different people. You're right. The economic, just economic meltdown has impacted so many different people, including individuals who were upper middle class. I remember reading a New York Times piece about this, group of highly paid, originally highly paid individuals. One of them was a corporate lawyer. And she's like, I can't pay my bills now, and I can't find another job that I'm qualified for, because she's overqualified for a lot of the jobs that are available. And the jobs that are available do not pay a high enough wage for her to pay her bills. Like, it's insane what people are dealing with right now.
For 800,000 jobs lost a week. I mean, I think that at the height of the Great Recession, after the financial crisis, it was something like 800,000 jobs a month. And at the time, that seemed like a free for all. And now it's 800,000 jobs a week. It's crazy. It's crazy, and something is going to happen. Like something big is going to happen. The question is what? Like I mean, maybe like they're just gonna like kind of manage this decline indefinitely, but I just don't see how, like, I don't see like kind of the ideological buy-in for something like that. Like something big is gonna happen, whether it's, I mean, again, it's like that old cliche, like it's gonna probably either be socialism or barbarism. You know, barbarism has a pretty big head start right now, but that's something's gonna happen. Like it's just. You can't go on like this. Like this is just it's so unprecedented that something new has to emerge from it.